Now, of course, those are the waveforms found on the Minimoog, but and also the octaves of those waveforms. There is not variation between oscillators where the waveforms sound differently on each oscillator. It would be interesting if that were the case. Wouldn't that be kind of a cool thing, actually? Anyway, that is not the case. And so the octave settings are all the same. Oscillator 3 has some functionality that we will cover in a different video. But in general, then we have the tuning of these oscillators. And we have, of course, like I said, the main tune tunes oscillator 1. And then oscillator 2, which we'll turn on. The tuning knob tunes oscillator 2 and goes up about a sixth. And of course, it allows you to change the tuning relationship between oscillator 1 and the architecture of the synth so that you can have different intervals playing simultaneously. I go directly to a tritone. Great job, Mark. If you're doing any sort of evil music, you can do this tritone. Super cool. Which is obviously helpful. I mean, there's a lot of times when you may want to have an interval in your your performance, prog rock, and but also keep in mind that this is not, and this is a can of worms. This is not a subtractive synthesizer because you have multiple oscillators. When you have multiple oscillators, you have the ability to create new sets of harmonics. And when you do that, you're actually engaging in a sort of pseudo additive synthesis. So, for example, I can play this second oscillator like I am, and they're both basically at the same amplitude. But then I can back this thing off. We get back to just oscillator 1, but if I bring up oscillator 2, now it has a different timbre because right now oscillator 2's sawtooth is happening at a different frequency, providing different harmonics, but it's not loud enough to sound like two different waveforms happening together. Oscillator 2's waveforms are quiet enough that they're just acting like harmonics added to oscillator 1, and therefore we're not hearing two different notes. We're hearing one note with a new spread of harmonics, which is a different timbre. That's the weird way the harmonics work. If they're loud enough, they're a note. If they're quiet enough, they're a timbre. So when you're using a Minimoog, you are not stuck with a sawtooth and a square or two sawtooths stacked on top of each other. You have the ability to create complex waveforms with the Minimoog by doing exactly this. And so like we can theoretically go into oscillator 3, set it to, I don't know, sawtooth triangular, and then set it to some other octave. So now it's no longer, it's in a different octave and it has a different tuning. So who knows what note it's even on other than perfect pitch people. So then we can go back to our first oscillator. I've added it just enough that all of a sudden you've got this weird element that didn't exist and it doesn't sound like another note. I've just added harmonics to our original note. So we can bring in oscillator 2 too. you're not hearing that perfect fourth that's existing in oscillator 2 as a separate note. You're hearing oscillator 1 having a lot of weird jangly harmonics that exist elsewhere. Now, these are not the most pleasing examples of this process, but you can definitely fine-tune your sound by creating different sets of harmonics with the other oscillators set low enough so that they are not providing a new note, but instead are just adding weird harmonics to your first note. So, and that's one of the main things to remember about the Minimoog's 3 oscillators, is it's not just like, let's turn them all on so it sounds big, or let's play a square and a saw at the same time, which does result in basically the same sort of thing that I'm talking about. But when you have the doubling, the unison doubling or octave doubling, it's kind of a different thing than specifically just adding harmonics to your sound, which is an interesting process. And there's a lot of ways you can do it. Like you can have, we could be adding harmonics down low. Anyway, it is a really helpful process to create complex waveforms with the Minimoog. And people always describe the Minimoog as being so simple because, you've only got these simple waveforms and a filter. But it's because people are not employing the Minimoog in the way that they should, which is as a synthesizer to create new timbres, which are eminently possible with this, especially when we get into using oscillator 3 as a audio range modulation source. We're talking about cross mod. You can get some really, it's the same thing as a complex oscillator on a buchla in the sense that you are modulating an oscillator in the audio range to create new complex waveforms. So we'll talk about that in another video. But we do have the opportunity to overlay multiple oscillators, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. Like, for example, here is the sawtooth. Well, first of all, let's try 2 sawtooth triangulars. If it's just one, it's very nice. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But like adding another one adds that chorusing, as the 2 oscillators are not perfectly in tune at all times, and sometimes quite distant from that. It's a really wonderful sound. And then, of course, there's always octaves. And it doesn't have to be perfectly, like aligned octaves. You can start with 1 octave and just bring one up enough so you just get a fuller sound in general. If you're playing this right now, like if you just heard this out of the blue and hadn't seen me just do it, you wouldn't be like, oh, those are 2 oscillators and octaves. You would just have this big full sound. And once again, you could always tune. There's always the opportunity for tuning. This third tuning, people don't do it anymore. It's either fourths or fifths. No one ever does the third things anymore. And so you hear it a lot in like 70s music, and it sounds really cool, and it's very evocative of that time. But it's something that can be used. Anyway, and once again, we can throw in... I know I sounded like, oh, this isn't just for stacking oscillators. I know I said that before, but I mean, when you do, it certainly isn't bad. And And then when you throw the filter on top of this, of course, you're going to get, you know, a wide variety of different sounds that kind of force these three different oscillators doing different things to sound like they are a group, you know, actively working together. So yeah, you can't go wrong with 3 Minimoog oscillators ever. But we have basically covered the basics of the Minimoog oscillators found on the Moog Minimoog.